Be'ezras Hashem, with Hashem's help, we begin today a new book of Rambam. This is the longest book of the entire Rambam, 144 chapters, so we are really embarking on about a 5-month project. And it's a very daunting book for many people because it covers a subject that's so foreign to us. We don't keep it pretty much in any level, with the exception of within a marriage for a woman who is on her monthly period. But typically, in daily life, the laws of purity and ritual impurity do not affect us. And because the concepts are so distant from our reality, they also seem distant from our understanding, at least to many people. It's not the case. As we're going to see, the Rambam is a master organizer, an explainer. Everything is going to be clear, everything is going to be concise, everything is going to be able to be understood. But we should approach it with the knowledge that we're really entering territory that we haven't really explored before. I know myself, in terms of my knowledge and my deep understanding of areas of halacha, ritual impurity and purity is one of those where it's least wholesome. And I'm looking forward to the journey with you because I know that I've learned Rambam during this cycle in a way I've never learned it before. And no doubt this book is going to be the same thing. Of course, the whole idea of ritual purity and impurity is not tangible. It's not a physical thing you can touch with your senses. It's a spiritual energy. And it's completely a Torah concept. The Rambam writes as one of the chukim. It's one of the mitzvahs we don't understand. But the Eibishter tells us, God dictates in his Torah, that there's energy that passes through certain type of objects, certain type of creatures, certain types of states within a creature. And by knowing these halachas, we tap into literally one of the most spiritual parts of the Torah, because it's something that we cannot observe, but it travels in the way and by the guidelines that Hashem teaches. So here we go. We're entering the journey. We're going to be introducing a lot of new concepts during this book, but instead of giving a huge introduction, which is just going to overwhelm the students, we're going to take it step by step. As the Rambam introduces concepts, so will we. And let's get started. As the Rambam always does, he opens each book with a verse from the Tanakh that is related to the subject of this book. And here he chooses a verse from Psalms, from Tehillim. We actually say it every night in the Kriyas Shema at night, chapter 51. It says, Leiv Tahir, Brali Elikim. King David asks, God, create for me a pure heart, V'ruach nochain chadesh b'kirbi, and renew within me a spirit of uprightness. Sefer Asiri v'hu Sefer Tara. This is the 10th book, and it's the book of purity. What an amazing name for the Rambam to call this book. The whole book is about impurity. All the ways to become impure, all the ways to transmit impurity. The Rambam begins with a verse that talks all about purity, and he calls the name purity. Even though the very first law, as we're going to see, is the worst type of impurity, impurity from a corpse. And the Rebbe once said this is a hint to the idea of ishapcha, the transformative power of a Jew. A Jew needs to take the lowest of the low, what seems to be the most impure, and elevate it to a state of spiritual purity. And our whole attitude to the idea of ritual impurity is to achieve the goal of ultimately changing that into a force of purity. Hilchos of Shmeina v'zehu Siduran. Says the Rambam, we're going to have 8 sections of laws in this book in the following order. Hilchos Tumas Meis. First, the laws governing the impurity of a corpse, how it can transmit impurity to other things. Hilchos Para Aduma, the laws of the red heifer, because that's the way you become pure from corpse impurity. Hilchos Tumas Tzaras, the laws of impurity imparted by the lesions that we have on the skin. Hilchos Metame Mishkav U'Meishav, the laws of those sources of impurity that transmit the impurity to the places that they lie and where they sit. Hilchos Shara V'Satumes, the laws of other primary sources of impurity. There are many, like a dead animal, for example, an animal carcass. Hilchos Tumas Eichlin, the laws of impurity contracted and transmitted by foods. Hilchos Kelim, the laws of impurity contracted and transmitted by utensils, which utensils can become impure, which utensils can transmit impurity. And Hilchos Mikvah is finally the law of emerging from impurity, the laws of the mikvah, the ritual pool in which one immerses and becomes pure. And we begin with Hilchos Tumas Meis, the laws of impurity of a corpse. Mitzvahs asay achas. Says the Rambam, it's going to be a month we're going to be on this, but all of it is covering just one mitzvah. V'hu din Tumas Meis, the law that a corpse can transmit impurity, and we have to know what classifies as a corpse, how does a corpse go about making things impure, and all the different varying levels and degrees that are involved in this mitzvah. Bir mitzvah zayis, beprakim elu, the explanation of this mitzvah is coming in the following 25 chapters, God willing. So, just before we start, to give a little introduction. We're going to be learning about a corpse. This is going to be our corpse for all of these halachas. That's Mr. Dead Man. In the Torah, there are two types of sources of impurity. Some, if you come into contact with them, make you impure for 7 days. Those are a very high level of impurity. The corpse is one of them. This is going to be our 7-day icon. Whenever we have something that imparts tuma of 7 days, it's called Tumas Shiva. That's going to be the icon we're going to use. In contrast to that, we have what's called Tumas Erev. Tumas Erev means tuma only until the evening. When you come into contact with a certain source of impurity, you're only impure till nightfall. And we have a different icon for that, which we'll show in a moment. When it comes to a corpse, we're going to be learning about 3 primary ways that a corpse transmits impurity. There are going to be many definitions and specifics to each one of these, but these are the 3 general ones. Number 1 in Hebrew is called maga. Maga means touching. I really didn't want to get political, so I didn't use the logo that I had in mind for this, but really, maybe just a sneak peek. Here's what I wanted to have for MAGA, okay? The MAGA hat. That would be the MAGA, but we're not doing it. Chabad, we're apolitical, we're staying out of it. So this is going to be our MAGA symbol. Don't touch. Touch. Direct contact with a corpse makes you impure. The second one is called Masa. I use the NASA logo. Again, I'm just trying to have some logos that we can go to in our minds and always remember them. We just put an M here. Masa. Masa means carrying, literal translation. Again, we're going to see there's many, many specifics. And the third is called Oyhel. Oyhel literally means a tent. And as we're going to learn, there are 3 forms that this can take. If you become a tent over a corpse, that means you go over a corpse like this. If a corpse becomes a tent over you, or if both you and the corpse are under the same roof. All those 3 are oyel, and by virtue of that, the energy, the spiritual impure energy travels. Because the first 2 are kind of easier to understand. There's direct contact, at least you're carrying. Here, this is completely ethereal. Because the 2 of you are in the same room, under the same roof, the tuma transmits from the corpse to the person. Or because you walked over it, you catch the tuma. Or because it went over you, you get the tuma. A very, very refined, sublime, transcendent, not a tangible concept, but these are the 3 main ways that a corpse transmits impurity, and that's what we're going to be focused on in the beginning of these laws. Halacha, Perek Risha in chapter 1, Halacha Aleph, says the Rambam. Meis, a corpse. Mitame, can transmit impurity. Bemaga, through contact. Uvemasa, and through carrying. Uveoihel, and through a tent, which again has 3 meanings. Tumas Shiva, and the type of impurity which it transmits is the tuma of 7 days. You touch a corpse in any of these 3 ways, you become impure for 7 days. Says the Rambam, Tumas Maga v'oihel mefurashin b'Torah. The impurity transmitted by touching and by tent are explicit in the Torah. Shenemar, it says in the portion discussing corpse impurity, Hanoigeya b'meis l'chol nefesh adam, somebody who touches, there you have it, the word noigeya, touches a dead body, any type of soul of any human, v'tamei shivas yamim, he'll be impure for 7 days. Can't get clearer than that. V'nemar, it also says explicitly, the beginning of the verse says, Zeis ha'Torah adam ki yamus be'oyel. This shall be the law of a person who dies in a tent. So you have a corpse inside a tent. V'nemar, it says, kol ha'ba'el ha'oyel. Anybody that enters the tent. V'chol asher ba'oyel. And anybody or anything which is already in the tent when the corpse dies, yitma shivas yamim, shall become impure for 7 days. So we have maga, touching, and we have oyel. But we don't find a verse in the Torah which talks about carrying for a dead body. And right here says that Rambam halacha beis tumas masa mipi ashmua. The idea that a corpse transmits impurity via carrying is something learned from oral tradition directly from Moshe Rabbeinu on Mount Sinai. And we use the method that's called the kal v'chomer hadvarim. A kal v'chomer, a fortiori. You learn from something lighter to something stricter. If something lighter has a stringent law, then certainly the thing that's stricter should also carry the strict law. That's one of the basic principles of exegesis in the Torah. To demonstrate this, I'm going to use the following picture. Balloons represent what's light, the rocks represent what's heavy. The Rambam is going to compare and contrast nevela, which is the carcass of an animal, which is one of the primary sources of impurity, which we're going to learn about later in this book. It's a lighter source of impurity. It's not as stringent as the corpse. The corpse is the heavy one. That's why I have him on the rocks. Rocks represent the heaviness, the weight, the stringency of the corpse impurity. So now says the Rambam, consider the following. Im nevela, if a dead carcass, shehi tumas erev, which is lighter in the fact that it only makes you impure till evening. This is going to be our logo for the evening impurity. Ve'eina metama ba'ohel, and we know that it does not transmit impurity through a tent. If you walk over a dead carcass of an animal, if a dead carcass goes over you, if you're in the same room, you don't become impure. And nevertheless, metama b'masa, we find that it has the stringency of becoming impure through carrying. Shenemar, as it says clearly in the Torah, I didn't put the verse up, but trust me, it says in the Torah, V'hanoiseyas nivlasam, one who carries the dead carcass becomes impure. So the nevela has less going for it. There's no impurity of a tent, there's less days of impurity, and yet it transmits impurity by carrying. Meis like kol shekain. So a corpse, which is stricter than the nevela in both of those things, it has longer point of tuma, 7 days, and it does become impure or transmit impurity through a tent. How much more so that it should also transmit impurity through carrying. Now, that's one stage. We've now transplanted the idea of masa from here to masa from here. However, there's one more point that has to be addressed. The type of impurity that one would contract if one carried the nevela would only be the lesser type of impurity till evening. So maybe, if I'm transplanting this masa to here, maybe the corpse should have at least a lighter element in that respect. Yes, it will be able to transmit impurity through carrying, but only a lighter type of impurity until evening. So the Rambam right away addresses that. He says, no. Once you transplant it and it takes on all the laws that are over here. Uma nevela, just like a carcass. Shemaga tumas erev. When you touch it directly, you become impure for the evening, till the evening. And masa tumas erev, its carrying also makes you impure for the evening. Af hamei, so to a corpse. Shemagoy tumas shiva, since touching it directly will make you impure for 7 days. Masoy tumas shiva, carrying it will also make you impure for 7 days. In other words, once it enters the realm of the corpse, it takes on the corpse's laws and also becomes impure for 7 days. So we learn the concept of masa impurity from the nevela, but once we've learned the concept, we apply the rules governing the corpse. Now says the Rambam, even though we just learned this out from exegesis, Ein tumas masa b'meis midivrei seifrim. Do not think that the impurity of carrying by a corpse is only rabbinic in nature. Elo din Torah. It's a biblical law. When you derive something through exegesis, it becomes biblically binding. V'yirah, it seems to me, says the Rambam, sheshasak mimeno hakasuv, that the reason Torah was quiet about it is kederach sheshasak me'isur abbas. The same way we find elsewhere in laws of forbidden relationships, Torah is quiet about forbidding a daughter. Nowhere in the Torah do you find a verse that says you cannot have relations with your daughter. But it's so obvious. Lefisha asar befeidosh afilu bas habas. Torah clearly forbids relations even with the granddaughter, the daughter of a daughter. So how much more so the daughter? No need to say the daughter. Here's another example. V'shasak me'isur achilas basar b'chalav. Torah is quiet about forbidding eating meat and milk. Lefisha asar befeidosh afilu bishulay. Because explicitly it says you can't even cook it. So if you can't even cook it together, certainly you can't eat it. Kach, in the same way, shasak mitumas masa b'meis. Torah was silent and didn't talk about the tuma of carrying when it comes to a corpse. Because it clearly made you impure even by just being in the same room as it. Kol sheken masai, certainly carrying it. And that's the kal v'chemer that Rambam was alluding to before, that if a nevela doesn't have ohel, it has masa, so if a meis has ohel, certainly it should have masa. And now that we've established the 3 types of tuma, let's go back and define each one. The Rambam is going to define maga, the Rambam is going to define masa, and the Rambam is going to define ohel, each one in this chapter. Halacha gimel tumas maga ha'amura b'chol makom. Whenever we use the term maga, touching, bein b'meis, bein b'shara mitamim. Truth is, whether it's a corpse or any other source of impurity. We're going to be dealing with many sources of impurity, and many of them transmit impurity through touching. When we talk about touching, what do we mean? Hushenoga ha'adam bivsarai batuma atzma. It's direct contact between the person's flesh and the corpse or the source of impurity itself. Not your clothes. We'll soon see about clothes, the details, but as a theme, the maga in its primary state is not through clothes or through any intervening substance. It's direct contact between the flesh and the flesh. And direct contact can happen in many ways. Bein biyadai, whether you're touching it with your hand. Bein beragle, whether with your feet. Bein b'shar b'sarei, the rest of your body. V'afilu bil shayna, even with the tongue. Hareza nitma, you become impure. V'chein nirali, it seems to me also says the Rambam, she'im naga b'tziparnav. If you touch it only with your fingernails, ay b'shinov, or with your teeth, which seem to be almost separate elements of the body, nitma, as long as it's attached to you, you become impure. That's called touching the corpse. Kevan she'im mechubarim laguf, hareim kaguf. Since the nails and the teeth are attached to the body, they're like the body. Aval, but for example, what's an example of not touching? Im tachav adam tuma b'kaish. Let's say a person stuck a source of impurity onto a skewer. And he put it directly into the throat of a pure person. And it didn't touch his tongue either. Or he put it into the uterus of a woman from the underside, without it touching any part of her outside flesh. The person who swallows the source of impurity doesn't become impure on account of touching. That's not called touching. Because it didn't touch the outside of his flesh. Touching on the inside is not considered to be halachic touching. And therefore, that guy might be impure because he's holding the source of impurity, but he stuck it into your throat, you haven't touched it. Halacha dalid, here are other questions we have to address, whether they're called touching. Krum sha'alamaka, a scab that arises on a wound. With regard to touching for impurity, it's considered your skin. If you touch a source of impurity with a scab, you become impure. If you touch the scab of a corpse, you become impure. Whereas what we call peach fuzz, these little hairs that grow on a young baby, those are not considered to be like skin with regards to touching impurity. Keita, what would that mean practically? If a source of impurity touched the scab of your own wound, you become impure as though it touched your skin. But if the source of impurity touched the peach fuzz on the flesh of a child, the child does not become impure. Of course, if you touch the skin, then yes, but if it just rubs against the peach fuzz, that's not impurity. Or if there was an impure person, which he had a wound, and a pure person touched the scab of the wound of the impure person, he becomes impure. If there was a child who was impure, and an adult who was, or another person who was pure, touched his peach fuzz, he has not become impure. Meis, Tumas, whether it's talking about Tuma of the corpse, which is our subject, or any other source of impurity. And similarly, other things that attach themselves to the body. Little blotches of human waste or other kinds of filth or mud. And similar things, those things that are not considered intervening substances when it comes to the laws of mikveh, as we'll see in the end of the book. Or dried pieces of waste, things that do considered intervening substances on the body, as we'll see in the laws of mikveh. Any these things that attach themselves to the body, they're not considered to be your skin, they're foreign. Not to transmit impurity, nor to contract impurity. Halacha hey, talking about touching, talking about contact, kashem sha'adam mistame binigiyase batuma, the same way a person, here's the slide I wanted, same way a person becomes impure when he touches a source of impurity, in this case a corpse, kach hakelim mistamim binigiyas atuma bohen, so too utensils, they're not alive, but Torah says, if a source of impurity touches them, they become impure. Chutz miklei cheres, with the exception of earthenware utensils, she'ene mistame ela me'aviroi. That direct contact is not a factor. What matters is that the source of impurity enters its airspace. If a dead mouse falls inside and you're holding it, even if it doesn't touch any of the walls, that's what makes it impure. On the other hand, if you put a dead mouse to the outside of the vessel, you've touched it, it doesn't become impure. As will be explained at length in the laws governing the vessels and utensils, how they become impure. V'zeu klal gadol betuma. Even though we're not getting into it right now, the Rambam just he drops us a big principle. Something to remember when it comes to sources of impurity. Kol ha-metame adam b'maga, metame kelim. Any source of impurity which can transmit its impurity to a person through touching, metame kelim also can transmit impurity to utensils. V'chol she'ene metame adam b'maga, eine metame kelim. If you cannot transmit impurity to a person through touching, then you're not powerful enough to transmit impurity either to utensils. Ve'ein adam b'kelim. Another principle to remember is that both humans and utensils are not mekablin tuma. They cannot receive, they cannot contract impurity, ela me'av hatuma, only from what's called a primary source of impurity. Not getting into it right now. We've come across this concept earlier in the Rambam, the idea that there are certain things that are called avois hatuma, primary sources of impurity, and then you have children, so to speak, or lower degrees of tuma. If something touches something that's an avatuma, it becomes a rishon l'tuma, first degree, second degree, third degree. A person and utensil can only become impure by touching a primary source of tuma. No secondary source of tuma can make a person or kelim impure. But again, this is a side rule, not related to the main subject here at hand. We're going to get to it and expand on it throughout this book in many, many different ways. And so we've covered the laws of touching. Touching as a theme, again, means direct contact, skin to skin, and whatever qualifies as skin. Halacha vav, Tumas masa. Now we talk about the Tumah of carrying. Whenever we use the word carrying, bein Meis, bein b'shar kol hamitamim b'masa, whether we're talking about a corpse or any other source of impurity which transmits its impurity through carrying, hu sheyisa ha'adam hatuma, it means that a person carries the source of impurity, af al pi shelei nagaba, even though he didn't touch it. See, if carrying meant carrying it in my hands, then I don't have to call it a new type of impurity. Why is masa different than maga? Maga also is touching. I'm touching skin to skin. Carrying is a novelty in that you can end up carrying the source of impurity without touching it. Just the fact that you're carrying it makes you impure. Afilu haya beino leveina even. Even if there was a stone between you and it. Let's say you're carrying a stone, and on the stone is a dead mouse. Hayil v'nasa nitma, but you've carried it. So you become impure. It doesn't matter if you're carrying it on your head, or you're carrying it on your hand, or you're carrying it in any other part of your body. The point is you're carrying it, and there's a source of impurity that's being carried because of you. Also doesn't matter whether you picked it up yourself, you began to carry it, or somebody else picked it up and put it on top of you on your back. Since it was carried, as long as it was carried on you, in any state, nitma, you become impure. Even if the tumah was hanging by a thread, and you're holding the thread, or by your hair, and you hung the thread in your hand and lifted, essentially carried the tumah, even at the slightest amount, you are called carrying, and you have become impure. So carrying means carrying it on any part of your body without touching it. Halacha zayin, meisit bichlal noisehu. Another thing that goes under the umbrella of carrying is called meisit. Meisit is, we'll see in a moment, it's very identical to carrying. It's not exactly carrying, but it's basically moving. By the force of your moving, the source of impurity has moved. Anything which can transmit impurity through carrying also transmits impurity through what's called heset. Meisit is the act. When a person does it, it's called he's being meisit. Heset is the noun. The noun is movement, we'll call it. Ketzat, what is an example of this? So we have a couple of examples. Imagine you have a beam lying on a wall. On one side you have a corpse. Here's the beam, here's the corpse on one side. Or a dead carcass of an animal, whatever it might be. Comes the pure person to the other edge of the beam, and he moves it. So he hasn't carried it, no lifting involved. He just moves it. So long as he moves also as a result of his movement, he moves the source of impurity on the other end, he is called impure on account of carrying. Needless to say, if it was a seesaw, you have a corpse lying over here, and you pulled the other end towards the ground till you caused the tumah to be lifted. Or in the case where you dragged the corpse through the beam on the ground, that's for sure called carrying. This and all acts similar to it, tumas heset is the tumah of heset, of movement, mentioned in every place. But it always goes under the umbrella of masa. If you hear the word masa, it includes both masa, actual carrying, and heset, movement caused by your movement. If somebody carries using a part of his body which is usually covered, or inside an internal cavity, nitma, you become impure. Touching on the inside is not called touching, but carrying on the inside is called carrying. Even though touching is not touching over there, if you carry it over there, you're carrying. With the exception of a person who swallows. If you swallow it into your stomach, all the way into your intestinal system, once it reaches into your stomach, you're nothing. You're not a toucher, you're not a carrier. So much so, even if you go to the mikveh, and the thing is still in your system, you're considered pure, even if the source of impurity is still inside your stomach. But, unlike, let's say, touching, where if a person were to put something into the underside of a woman, yeah. Halacha tes, ein mistame b'masa elo ha'adam bilvat, lo ha'kelim. Unlike when it comes to maga, touching. Even utensils can become impure. When it comes to masa, carrying, only a person can become impure through carrying, not utensils. And therefore, Ketzad, what does this look like? Consider the case where a person is carrying 10 utensils, 10 bowls, one on top of the other. And there's a carcass sitting in the top one. The person who's carrying all of this is considered to be carrying. He'll become impure for carrying a nevela. But the utensils, all the ones in his hand, are all pure, except for the uppermost one, which actually touched directly the impurity, but none of the lower ones. And the same applies in all similar situations. And that covers the tuma of masa, of carrying. And now we go on to tumas oyel. It says the Rambam, Tumas oyel, halacha yud, eina bishar tumas, ala b'meis bilvat. The first most important thing to know is that this is a feature of impurity that is unique to corpses. It doesn't exist in any other source of impurity. And therefore it's only going to be discussed during this next month that we're on to the laws of Tumas Meis. After that, we're done with it. Tumas oyel is only by a corpse. And oyel includes, as I mentioned, 3 scenarios. Ubein shehe'ehil ha'adam oy hakli. Whether it's the person or the utensil that's forming the tent. Afilu machat, even if it's a needle. Shehe'ehila al hameis, that formed a roof over a corpse. That would be this scenario here. The person is bending over the corpse. Oy shehe'il hameis al ha'adam al hakelim. Or the corpse became a roof over a person or over utensils. Or the corpse, together with a person or utensils, was under the same roof. They are impure. By the way, the Rambam didn't say it clearly, but it's obvious from the context that even kelim can become impure through oyel, through the tumah of tent. So whenever, in any place that we use the word tumas oyel, that means that the source of impurity can transmit impurity to a man or to utensils in one of these 3 ways. Now let's just spend some time defining the third way, the way where you share a roof. It doesn't matter whether you enter fully into the tent or under the roof where the corpse is, or you enter partially. You've become impure through the tent. Even just your hand, you put in just your hand, or your fingertip, or just your nose, into the room, under the roof, shared by a corpse. Your entire body has become impure. If you touch the lintel of the tent, and you join your hand to the lintel, it's unclear, the commentaries discuss if it means both things, you have to do both or just one. The point is, let's just imagine that you did the second one, okay? You touched the lintel in a way where you kind of extended the doorway. Now your hand is part of the lintel. Nitma ki'ilu ba miktsaseh. The rabbi said, this makes you impure as if you entered the tent partially. Noga b'yiskupa, if you touched the threshold, mitefach u'lemata karev la'aretz, so the handbreadth closest to the ground, tahar, you're actually pure, because it's considered part of the earth. But if it's above 1 handbreadth, you're impure. It seems to me, says the Rambam, that this impurity is a rabbinic imposition over and above the regular tumah of sharing a roof of tent. And now, at this point, we've defined all 3 types of tumas. Now that Rambam spends some time defining who can become impure with these types of impurities. First of all, the corpse. The corpse, whether it's a Jewish corpse or a non-Jewish corpse, it transmits impurity in the first 2 ways. The ways of touching and the ways of carrying. Let's just find our little picture here so we can always be mindful of what we're talking about. Both Jewish and non-Jewish corpses transmit these 2 types of impurity. However, a Gentile corpse does not transmit impurity through the tent, where there's no level of direct contact whatsoever. This is a matter of tradition. It says in the war that the Jews waged against Midian, which clearly involved Gentiles, it says, anybody who touched a dead body has to become purified, has to immerse himself. It doesn't mention the tent. So a special rule that a non-Jewish corpse only has the first 2, not the third type of impurity. So too a live Gentile, he cannot become impure with corpse impurity. If a Gentile touched a dead body, carried it, or became a tent over it, it's as if he never touched it. It has no ramifications. Says the Rambam, what can it be compared to? As though it's an animal that touched a dead body or became a tent. It has no meaning. It has no significance. For the non-Jew, it also has no significance. And the truth is, not only is this true of corpse impurity, all types of impurity, Gentiles nor animals can become impure through them. Mystically, it's a very, very deep concept. The whole idea of impurity only exists by a Jewish body. Why? Because what's the idea of impurity, according to Kabbalah? Anything that's opposed to God or non-godly is living on a very, very limited amount of godly energy. The Jewish soul is filled with godly energy. And therefore, the negative forces are always trying to bring the Jew down into their realm so they can draw some of his spiritual force. And therefore, only a Jew is subject to impurity because only him are the klipa forces, the negative forces, chasing. They're not chasing the other elements of creation that don't carry that profound spiritual energy, and therefore they cannot contract any sort of impurity. Halacha Yudalid, nevertheless, umidivrei soifrim, rabbinically, sheyehu ha'oiv dekechavim kezavin l'chol divreihem. We treat Gentiles as a default baseline like a zav, like a man who has an irregular discharge. There's a level of impurity that he has to deal with, which we're going to discuss later in this book. The Gentile, by default, carries that level of impurity. This was made to mitigate extra contact between the Jews and Gentiles who were, as a theme, unfriendly to the Jewish people at the time. And nevertheless, it stayed. This decree is that Gentiles are considered to be at a certain baseline level of impurity at all times. Says the Rambam, there is nothing amongst all living things, masha mistame v'hu chai, oy mitame v'hu chai, that can contract or transmit impurity while alive, chutz min ha'adam bilvad, only the human being. V'hu sheyim Yisrael, and that provided that he's Jewish. Every other thing which imparts impurity is dead. Animals have to be dead. Mice, rodents have to be dead. The only thing which can become or make others impure while they're alive is a Jewish person. Echad gadol ve'echad katan mistamin b'chalat tumas. Another general rule. Whether you're an adult or a child, you can become impure in all types of impurities. I feel with Tumas Meis, even the tumah of the corpse, where Torah actually uses the word shenemar ba ish asher yitma, where it says a man, when he becomes impure, typically ish excludes under bar mitzvah. We know a tradition here, echad ish ve'echad katan, this means both an older man and a child. Shaharehu eimer sham, because elsewhere, later in the context it says, actually earlier in the context it says, the al hanefashes, not kol hanefashes, the al hanefashes asher hayusham, and on the souls that were there. Any soul, which a child is also a soul, that enters the tent becomes impure. Afilu katan ben yoima, even a child in his first day of living, a newborn child. Shenagai nasai hayal alames, that touches, carries, or becomes a tent over a dead body, nitma, he becomes impure, Meis, and he is impure with the corpse impurity. Who, that's provided though, shenoilad letisha, that he was born full term, 9-month pregnancy. Aval ben shmeina, but if he's in the 8th month, ke'even ve'enim mekabel tuma, he's like a stone, he's not viable halachically, therefore doesn't contract impurity. Tesvav, one more important rule before we begin to go into the details of the dead body. Hameis einem mitame ad shetetze nafshe. A corpse is only considered impure enough to transmit impurity after his soul leaves the body. Afilu miguyad oigaises. Even if a person's main arteries have been cut, or he's in the throes of death. Afilu nishchatu by shnei asiman, and even if the 2 main pipes have been slaughtered. Eine metame ad shetetze nafshe. He doesn't transmit impurity until the soul and the viability leaves his body. Shenemar, because it says a person has to touch benefesh ha'adam asher yamus, the soul of man that dies. That means the soul itself has to leave. Nishbera mafraktoi v'reiv besara ima. However, if the person's backbone is broken, together with most of the surrounding flesh is torn open, nikra kedag migaboy, or he was torn open along his back like a fish, or he was completely beheaded, or he was split in 2 in the area of his stomach, he is already considered to be transmitting impurity, even if one of his limbs might still be twitching or convulsing. That's already clearly an end to life, and he becomes a halachic corpse, transmitting the 3 impurities that we already learned before, maga and masa and oihel.